So what if I told you that one of the most important leadership skills that you can develop has absolutely nothing to do with having people report to you? Like, you don't need a team, you don't need to have a title, you don't even need to actually think of yourself as a leader, because leadership is really how you lead yourself. It's how you respond when circumstances change, how you make decisions under pressure. And if you're able to recognize when the approach that you've been using and it's worked really well yesterday is not what you need today. And right now, two of the best coaches in basketball are giving us an absolutely fascinating lesson in exactly that. The Minnesota Lynx and Las Vegas Aces have become the first two teams to secure spots in the 2026 WNBA playoffs. Okay? So Minnesota got there first. They won 98-87 over Las Vegas. And then the Aces came in shortly after that. And the women leading them, Cheryl Reeve and Becky Hammon, have extraordinary track records. But here's what interests me. They don't lead the same way. So if two very different leaders can produce extraordinary results, maybe we're asking the wrong question when we ask, what's the best leadership style? That's what we're going to talk about. Hi, I'm Leeza Steindorf. I've spent decades helping leaders, Fortune 500 companies, and government organizations navigate communication, conflict, and change. And whether you're a WNBA coach, or you're running a company, or you're raising a family, or you're navigating a relationship, or you're simply trying to lead yourself through your own life, adaptability may be one of the most valuable skills that you can develop. Okay? So stay with me, because we're going to look at two remarkable leaders with two very different styles, but there's one principle that you can take from both of them and use it in your own life, because it's a unifying principle. It's pretty fascinating. So let's start with Cheryl Reeve. She's not simply having a good season. She's the winningest coach in WNBA history. She's a multiple-time champion, a multiple-time coach of the year, and she's been inducted in 2026 into the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame. And when you watch Minnesota, there's something really striking about them. They look like they know who they are. Like, that doesn't mean that they always win, and it doesn't mean that Reeve is always happy with them. As a matter of fact, after Minnesota recently had its 10-game winning streak and then it snapped, Reeve was openly critical of their defense. And then Minnesota responded by beating Las Vegas and getting the first playoff berth in the league. So that's important, because consistency isn't doing the same thing over and over again. Consistency is actually maintaining a standard while changing what you do to meet it, because you need to adapt, right? So if you think about that difference, if something isn't working in your career, in your relationship, your business, or your own personal habits, consistency doesn't mean, well, this is how I've always done it, so I'm just going to keep doing it that way. That's actually rigidity, right? It's not going to get you where you want to go. But a standard, if you say, I know where I want to go, and now I need to be willing to change how I get there and respond to circumstances. And Minnesota's had to do exactly that, right? Players change, and you got injuries, and a rookie like Olivia Miles, right? She arrives and suddenly changes what your team's even capable of. And Nafisa Collier misses time and then returns. So the goal stays, the route changes. But that raises, I think, an interesting question. What happens when adapting doesn't mean changing a strategy? What happens when adapting means actually making a decision that other people may not like? And that's where Becky Hammon comes in, okay? So Becky Hammon's got a totally different style. She's direct, she's intense, and she's built a championship culture around expecting a lot from her players. But one of the best examples of her leadership this season actually came from a game that the Aces lost. So Las Vegas was facing an extraordinary stretch, 3 games in, I think, 65 hours. Like, that's crazy. So Hammon made what on the surface sounds like a really terrible basketball decision. She rested A'ja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, and Jackie Young. Now, if you don't follow the WNBA, you need to understand what that means. Those aren't just 3 good players. They're like the core core of the aces. Like Asia Wilson is one of the greatest players in the game. Chelsea Gray and Jackie Young are elite players in their own right. So Hammon sat all three against one of the best teams in the league, and Las Vegas lost, like badly. So why would a great coach do that? Okay, let's think about that. She had a reason, and it's because Hammon wasn't coaching just that game. She was coaching the season, and she recognized that asking her stars to keep carrying that kind of a load through that kind of a schedule, those hours, right? Those 3 games in 65 hours would increase the risk of fatigue and of injury. And because aces had already put themselves in a really strong position, I'm going to say, she could afford to take a calculated risk. And I'm sure she really thought it through. But there's also another benefit. This is interesting. By sitting her stars, Hammon gave the rest of her roster something that actually coaches have a really hard time creating. And that is like having a meaningful playing experience under real pressure. So let me explain that. There's a huge difference between putting a bench player into the final 3 minutes of a game that you're already winning and then asking that same player to compete against a top team when the outcome really matters. One gives you the minutes, but the other one gives those players experience. And that experience matters later because championship teams eventually encounter moments when the stars are tired or they're injured or they're in trouble with fouls or they're double teamed or they're simply, having a bad night. So Hammon essentially, I'm going to say, traded some certainty today, right, for that game to have capability tomorrow, right? There was an exchange there and she knew it. It was calculated. And that's where this becomes bigger than basketball because adaptability doesn't mean changing something because you're panicking. It actually means understanding the situation well enough to know what you can afford to risk in order to build something that you may need later, like you're building a foundation and you're doing it with intention. And sometimes leadership means pushing your strongest people harder, and sometimes it means protecting them or taking them out and bringing other people in to build them as well. So that is the time where you deliberately step back so somebody else gets those opportunities to step forward. And that's true when you're leading a team, but it's also true when you're leading yourself. Think about it. Sometimes the thing that feels the safest, like relying on a skill that you have really evolved or a habit or a person that's always worked well, can actually prevent you from developing other options because it's become routine, because it's familiar, because you know. So how do you know what should stay constant and what you're willing to change? It's a good question. And that's where Reeve and Hammon's very different approaches suddenly show you the exact same principle. And here it is. Reeve and Hammon don't prove that there's one personality type that makes a great leader, okay? They prove almost the opposite. Like you can be quieter or louder. You can be more analytical or instinctive. Or you can challenge people like directly or create stability around them. So I'm going to call that style, and that's personal. But adaptability, that's a skill. And there's a very practical way to apply that to yourself. So when something isn't working, you can separate these two questions, okay? If you want to. What am I committed to? And how am I currently trying to get there, right? So what you're committed to, that stays constant. But how you're getting there, that may change. Those are two different things. So, for example, let's say you're committed to having a strong relationship. But that doesn't mean that the way you've been communicating is working. So you could possibly change that, right? Or you're committed to succeeding professionally. But maybe the career plan that you made 5 years ago doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe that needs to be updated. So you haven't changed your direction, but the means. Or maybe you're committed to your health or your family or being creative or something that you really committed yourself to for years. You don't have to abandon that direction simply because you've discovered that your current path, the way you're moving in that direction, isn't actually getting you there, or it's not as effective as it used to be. So, a clear destination can survive a change in how you approach it. And I think that's what two coaches demonstrate beautifully. Reeve adapts while she protects the standard, and Hammon adapts while she protects the people. So you got different leaders, different styles, but it's the same underlying skill. They're responding to what's actually happening, not what they are expecting to happen, right? And that's adaptability. That's being present and on point and responsive. So maybe that's the part of leadership I think that we don't talk about enough, right? We talk about what great leaders do and decision making and numbers and bottom line and all these things, yes. But great leadership, from my perspective, and I've worked with a lot of leaders, is recognizing when what you thought you knew for sure no longer actually fits the moment that you're in right now. And you don't need your employees to practice that. And you don't, in this example, you don't need a championship team, right? Every day we get opportunities to practice that when we're present and we're aware of our circumstances and we're clear of our destination, then we adapt and we move and we respond. Because ultimately, quite honestly, the person you'll be spending your entire life leading is you, right? So, something to think about. And if this gave you a different way also to think about leadership and how you lead your life, I invite you to subscribe. I'd love to have you join us for these conversations, because what I enjoy doing is looking at moments like these that everybody's talking about in sports and culture and everyday life, and asking, what can they teach us about communicating better, navigating change, and showing up more intentionally in our lives and for each other. Because what's happening around us, what's happening in our world, is such a great snapshot that we can use to learn about ourselves. And I'd love to know, if you want to share in the comment, when something isn't working for you, are you better at holding the standard or changing the strategy? Like, what works for you well? Okay? All right. Appreciate you listening. Thanks for being here. And until next time, be well.